Welcome to Public Speaking with Peter George. Do you want to be calm, confident, and credible every time you speak in public? Then stay tuned as Peter and his guests discuss public speaking tips, techniques, and tactics that help you increase your impact, influence, and income. Here's your host, Peter George.
The world of public speaking has continuously evolved over time, and probably never substantially in such a short period than it has during the pandemic. So it's no surprise that many professional and aspiring speakers are wondering how to be most effective. And that's exactly what Rael Bricker, a certified speaking professional, is going to help you figure out. From being 6,000 feet underground in a mine, to starting an education business that grew to have 4,000 plus students, to spending years working on venture capital, Rael has seen it all. And because he has experienced the roller coaster ride called business, he knows how to help people grow and achieve excellence. Rael holds 2 master's degrees and is a certified speaking professional with Professional Speakers Australia. In 2018, Rael published his book, Dive In: Lessons Learned Since Business School. It's intended to be a guide for people to learn from his experience and put those lessons into practice. As the blurb says, business does not have to be complicated, and I'll add, neither does public speaking. Here's my conversation with Rael Bricker. Hi, Rael. Welcome to the show.
Good morning.
Rael, let's start right up on the stage. Why do you always speak in front of a lectern?
Because I'm 5'6", and when I went to Toastmasters, I was even shorter. And so the Toastmaster stories of my father was a Toastmaster, took me to Toastmasters when I was 14, just because I had an interest in what they were doing there. And I learned very soon that lecterns were set at about 5 foot, or 4.5 foot, and I was probably just on 5 foot at the time. And so I had to develop a skill of standing in front of a lectern. And over the years, that's become, I guess, signature for me as a professional speaker, that I always move around the stage. I occasionally get accused of being a little bit like a caged tiger on the stage, pacing left to right and left to right. And I've had to actually work out how to control that, because when you're in front of the lectern, you're closer to the audience, and you tend to try and, if you've got a wide auditorium, you tend to try and bring them in. And so you kind of pace around to try and get people's eye contact. And unfortunately, sometimes you forget to slow down that pace because you want to get everybody. You want to be excited. You want to embrace everybody in your audience. And so you move around. And I find that freedom gives me energy on stage.
Did I hear you say you started at Toastmasters at 14 years old?
Yeah, I wasn't allowed to be a member, but I was going along, and a lot of the people there just went, yeah, okay, look, we know you can't be a member, but we'll start giving you things to say and do, because I'm a little exuberant. Even at 14, I wanted to have my voice and be heard.
Now, since you started when you were 14 with Toastmasters, at least, you must have seen speech structure change over the years.
I have. The traditional speech structure of Toastmasters, and so put that into a context. In Toastmasters, you become very good at 5 to 7 minutes speaking. And there was a little bit of stuff being introduced in Toastmasters of 8 to 10 minutes speaking about the time I left. But their traditional speech is 5 to 7 minutes. So you get very good at conveying one idea in 5 to 7 minutes, and with a traditional 1 minute open, 1 minute close, 5 minute content. That would have been their normal structure. As I've learned over the years, where I've done, 90-minute half-day speaking or half-day workshops and 90-minute keynotes, you can't work on that structure, because if you just do the big open and then you try and give lots of information, you will lose people in the audience completely. And so obviously in a workshop, it's different, where you've got 30 or 40 people, 20 people, and you're engaging them, and then you're making them stand up and break out and talk to their neighbor about something or discuss something at their table and then come back in. That's different. When you're doing, 60 to 90 minutes or 45 to 90 minutes, and you've got to keep your audience engaged for that period of time. You can't use a traditional speaking format of an opening, a body, and a conclusion. So that's definitely changed. I've never been one to purely embrace that idea. So I will always look for the shock opening, the question. I mean, my style has become one of questioning as an opening, because it does two things. So I either question or I will ask them. So there's one of my keynote speeches that I give. As an example, I actually have music playing in the background, right? I use Chariots of Fire. I have a music rights license for using that. And so I'll play Chariots of Fire in the background. Now, why Chariots of Fire? Because I find it quite an inspirational piece of music, and it doesn't have voiceover, so it's just instrumental. And I'll stand on stage and I'll ask the audience how they got there. And not in a metaphysical sense, right? Not how did they get there by taxi or by train that day. But I also make that joke. So I also ask them, I can start off very somber and ask them, how did you get here today? And I say, well, not by taxi. That's not what I want. And it sort of gets a bit of a laugh from the audience. But really, metaphysically, what brought you to this point in your life? And what brought you here to this point? And it was very relevant because I was the last keynote I did before COVID hit was in Kathmandu in Nepal. And I was opening speaker of a software conference for about 500 people. And I asked them this question, like, how did you get to Nepal on the Saturday? What brought you here to be listening to me? But the reason I do that is because I then I'm almost asking for permission to share my own story. So by asking them to consider how they got there, then I turn around and say, well, let me share with you how I got here. So that's a way of introducing myself and my story by putting it in a time frame or a context around them. And so that music only runs for about 60 seconds, potentially 45 to 60 seconds, depending on my audience. But then I've now brought them into my story, because I've made them think about their journey and brought them into my story. And it's not the hero story. It's not the traditional speech context of the hero story. I haven't got to the hero journey yet. It's just bringing them into a story that sets a context for my life.
Once you bring them in, when do you start to build towards that hero story?
You do straight away. I'll continue with that keynote because it'll put it into a context. That story for me is about how I learned to fly airplanes, or why I learned to fly airplanes. And I'll tell you the story because then it'll put into context. So the story very quickly is I used to work when I was a 21-year-old. I worked for Anglo American, which is a large mining house in South Africa. And they used to fly me as a 21-year-old engineer to mine sites about 4 hours out of Johannesburg. And so there I was, driving my old beat-up Toyota Corolla, arriving at the hangar where the Anglo-American had their own terminal. That's how big they were in South Africa at the time. And I got to the hangar, and I got there in my old Toyota, and I was in jeans because I'm going to a mine site. Jeans and a reasonable shirt, but not anything, no jacket, whatever. And all these guys started arriving in their big Mercedes with their chauffeurs being dropped off at the terminal to go on the same flight as me. And I went, okay, like they're in suits, whatever, at 6 a.m. I got on the plane takes off. I'm obviously clearly the youngest and most junior. And this is a very hierarchically structured organization where I parked in the third parking lot away from the office because I was a C4 level engineer. If I was a D1 level engineer, I would have parked in the second parking lot. That's how hierarchically structured it was. We get in the plane takes off, and on the floor is a cooler. And so the pilot puts his head around the window, the cockpit, and says, you can move around now. So I get up and I open the cooler, and I'm about to offer drinks to my fellow travelers, and I get a tap on the shoulder. And the joke I tell on stage is that thankfully it wasn't the hand of God because we were at 40,000 feet. But anyway, it was the most senior director of the company. And we're talking, major listed entity here. And he said, please don't do that. And I said, why? And he said, because in our planes, the most senior person has to serve the drinks, not the most junior. Now, that story at age 21 shaped my business career. And so on stage, talking about building businesses and building resilience and building rich and robust cultures, I use that contrasting story of this incredibly structured hierarchical business and me flying on small planes, which actually was where my interest in planes came from, and I became a private pilot eventually. But more importantly, it shaped my view of business, that you can be as hierarchically structured as you want, but then in the context of a plane, you can turn that around and the most senior person serves the drinks. And how did I apply that in my business life? So that was how I brought that into the hero's journey. But the story, and I have, pictures behind me. I never use lots of words on a screen. Behind me is always pictures, and those pictures are of a Citation and a Gulfstream plane. And the last plane I flew, which was a 1952 Boomerang. But that's how I set the scene. That's how I set the scene for the hero's journey of then my journey of discovery through businesses on 2 continents.
Sticking with keynotes, how do you bring it to a strong conclusion?
They say, and the guidance I was given by people was that a keynote has an idea every 10 to 12 minutes. Okay, and so the structure of it is you have a big idea, you have 3 major points around that idea, and if it's a long keynote, like a 90-minute or a 45 to 90-minute, you would then maybe have 3 points for each of the points. So breaking down 1, 3, 9. Okay. How do you bring it back? You have to relate back to how you started. Okay. And so that particular keynote of mine, which is the title of that keynote is If Culture Ate Strategy for Breakfast, What's for Dinner? Because it's a futurist view of culture in the organization. So absolutely. So I bring it back with a conclusion where I play the music again and I ask them to have considered their own journey. And now I'm going into the depth of what I spoke about, which is, have you considered your organization? And where has your organization come? And how do you see your organization in what I've just spoken about for the last 50 minutes or 45 minutes? Okay, the same music and about going on this journey. So it is about the journey, but the journey has this beginning and end, the bookends of the journey that bring it together. The problem I see with inexperienced speakers trying to do a keynote, and when I talk of keynote, a keynote, to define the difference, a keynote and a workshop. A keynote is someone on stage downloading information. A workshop is interactive. So you don't generally expect audience feedback except if you have questions in a keynote, if you have questions at the end. But with the difference between a keynote and a workshop is the download as opposed to the interactivity. And so you're standing up there, you're downloading. So you're watching the audience much more because it's also a bigger audience. You're watching them for your feedback cues. You don't want someone in the audience who has a competing view challenging you from the audience in the middle of a keynote. Whereas in a workshop, you want that challenge. You want those competing views. Otherwise, people are going, well, we've heard all this before. We started this part of the discussion about how have speeches changed. A lot of the work I do now uses behavioral styling, so behavioral modeling, behavioral profiling tools. So the most common one we use is DISC. Now, everyone, when I say the word DISC, a lot of people breathe, not that old thing again. Well, it is an old thing. It's been around since 1929, DISC profiling. And if you're not familiar with it, DISC stands for Dominance, Influence, Steadiness, and Compliance. Now, firstly, that's a hell of a mouthful for most people to remember. So the second thing is we've brought that into a simplistic terms of colors. So we talk of red, yellow, green, and blue behaviors. And that's not red being a danger or blue, whatever. It's just the terminology we use. And in fact, there are people who have taken a similar approach using animal names because, if you see yourself as the lion or the bear or the whatever, it's more real to people. We find that the colors make it simple. So if I turn around to you and say, you're a high green, that means you're about personal one-on-one relationships, etc. But you'll remember that. Whereas if I told you, you're a high S with a low C, you'll forget that in about 30 seconds. I'll explain the context of that. The problem is that reds or Ds want to make decisions quickly on some level of information. Yellows will also make quick decisions, but on more information, but on how does it affect our team. Greens want time to make a decision, but they want to know about how's it going to enhance relationships. And blue want detail. They want to delve in the rabbit hole. They want to go and see the spreadsheets and the proof. So when you're talking to an audience of 500 people, you can assume that the worldwide statistics of so many people are red, yellow, green, and blue applies to that audience. So the way I structure my talks now is based around those behaviors. Okay, so this is where it differs completely. So you start off with something that the reds enjoy. What do the reds enjoy? They want a bit of information and they want to be able to make a decision. So the problem is you stand on stage and you just rattle off information, and I've seen a lot of my competitors do that. They'll put up spreadsheets of information and interest rates and calculations and whatever, and they've lost half the audience already at that point. So I start off with something that deals with the reds. I tell them about something that makes it easy for them to make a buying decision, and when I say buying, every conversation we have with people is somewhat about selling. Because communication ultimately is about selling. Whether we're in a school board meeting, a PTA meeting, we're negotiating with our spouse, or we're selling to an audience or talking to an audience, we are selling them an idea. We may not be selling them something that gets dollars, but we're talking about an idea where we want them to follow our path and our idea. So with the reds, you make it easy for them. They want to know it's easy to do business with you, and they can do it quickly, and what's the price? Okay, so if there's money involved, they want to know the price. When you're talking to an audience and you do that, the reds start nodding. They're like bobbleheads. They start nodding. But those bobbleheads are now influencing the rest of the audience because they've got it. They've gone, yeah, I've got it. And then if you then delve into the detail, they'll pick up a mobile phone and start texting because they're bored. So the way you do that speech structure is you start with the reds, then you go to the yellows. Now, what are the yellows about? They're also about quick decisions, but about teamwork. So then you tell them how, by going along with your decision or your recommendation, it's good for their teamwork. And team doesn't necessarily mean a work team. It could just be family unit. It could be a social grouping, whatever. How's it going to affect the team? But then you circle back to the reds. And you give the reds some other bite of information that makes them go, oh, yeah, I'm with you. So now you have your reds and your yellows nodding. Then you move on to your greens and you talk about building long-term relationships and how they need, and how time is not important and people can take time to make decisions. And then you circle back to your reds and your yellows. And then you go to your blues, and blues want to be the spreadsheet people. They want to read all the testimonials. They want to delve into the detail, but you've already brought your red, yellow, green into the fold. So now you actually say, and I say it on stage, listen, for those of you who are not interested in the detail, and this is where a lot of people get concerned about speaking. If you speak from the heart, because it's about speaking from the heart, and I'm talking about finance now, right, in that context. And I'll say, right, for those of you who are not interested in all the details, just, sit there patiently for a little bit. But some of the people in this audience do want to know the details. So I'm going to delve into some detail, and then I'm going to come back to the big picture. So I tell them where we are on the journey. I tell them how that structure is happening, and then they're okay. If you just delve into the detail, the reds take out their phones, and then you've lost them. There's an old saying in sales that says you've sold past the close. At that point, you've sold past the close. So that's how structures change for me. It's about bringing the audience along on this journey.
What role does comedy play in speaking? And how has that changed over the years?
I have a terribly wicked sense of humor, probably a bit too risque for most people, because I see the humor in everything. I guess 20 years ago, 25 years ago, 15 years ago, political correctness and everything that goes with being PC was not that relevant. The comedy we could get away with 15 years ago, we can't get away with today. You have to sort of gauge your audience. Sometimes the best humor is self-effacing because it brings you down to a human level. Because remember, you're on a pedestal. As much as we don't see a stage as a pedestal, the stage is a pedestal. You're put up there. Somebody has stood up before you and said, Peter George is, blah, 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 and told me a whole thing and told the audience and built up a perception of who they are. So you've put them on a pedestal. So now you have to actually bring yourself down to human. So one of the stories I tell actually on stage when I'm talking about speaking is that a number of years ago, I was doing a presentation in a yacht club on the southwestern coast of Australia. There had been 100 people in the room. They only had two very small tables to set up the AV. So they had the computer on one and they had the projector on another. And I'm very animated when I'm talking. So I was, walking around and talking to people and engaging with people. And at that point, I said, does anyone have any questions? I can clarify now. And somebody put their hand up and asked a question, but they're talking very softly. As I stepped forward to answer them, I was right in the middle of the room. My knee caught the cable between the laptop and the projector. Okay, it wasn't my laptop, I must add. And the next thing I saw this laptop doing this slow dance and flying through the air and crashing into the ground. And so I looked at that and I said, I guess we don't have a presentation anymore. And I just carried on and I just spoke. At the end of it, I went to apologize to the organizers and I said, well, whatever you guys were paying me, I'll have to obviously pay for the laptop. But one of the guys said, oh, don't worry. I work for the education department, which is the government education department. And so I'll just take the laptop in tomorrow and get a new one. But for me, that was just one of the funniest sort of public speaking stories where I was, totally oblivious to the fact that there was a cable in front of me.
Rael, speaking professionally, as you know, can be really exciting, but it can also be very challenging. What drives you to be a speaker?
I used to say it's the adrenaline because I love the adrenaline. I love the fear. I know that sounds weird to say that, but no matter how many times I've spoken, there is always that small element of fear. And I think that is probably what keeps you alive, what makes you know you're alive. And so the challenge of professional speaking is engaging with the audience. Why do I do it? For me, it's about seeing the lights come on in people's eyes. So I'm doing some workshops in Southeast Asia for the next year. And I've told the company that everybody has to have their camera on because it's obviously still on Zoom. It's still a remote workshops. It's countercultural in that country for people to have their cameras on.
Is it?
And I said, there's no way I can do those workshops successfully without being able to see pretty much everybody across my screen. In my studio, I have 5 screens up, but on the 2 big screens, I can get 53 people's profiles up. And I can see their faces. Because for me, I can go, great, I delivered that talk really well. But if I don't see the reactions, if I don't see the lights come on in their eyes, I get paid. But the payment is meaningless because I haven't made meaningful change in those lives. And so that's why I do it.
As the current president of Professional Speakers Australia, how do you keep creating learning content?
It's hard because we have, like any audience, you don't have a homogenous audience, right? You have in our audience, in our chapter here in Western Australia and across Australia for that matter, you have those that have been on stage for 30 years to people who have just made the minimum requirement to be a member, which is $50,000 a year. The US requirement slightly less, but it's about 50,000 Australian a year to become a member, to become a CSP, which is I am. It's a much bigger requirement. But so you have those people who are just starting out their speaking career and those who've been around for 30 years as professional speakers. So my leadership and I were challenged. I mean, we challenged every year, and it's the same conversation. So as an example, this year, what have we done? So we've run a 2-hour strategy workshop. So myself and one of the other CSPs, we actually ran a 2-hour strategy workshop, which is part of a 2-day strategy workshop that we both run for corporates. But we focused it on individual businesses and how do you strategically plan for your speaking business. So again, finding content that was relevant. The May meeting that we had, we actually got 10 people from the experienced speakers to share their best tips for engaging audiences. Now, we're not just talking just random. We made it the beginning, the middle, and the end. So we said to those 10 people, which part are you really good at? What part of a workshop or a keynote are you really good at? The beginning, the middle, and the end. So how do you energize the room coming in? How do you re-energize the room after a coffee break, after a lunch break? And how do you leave them on a high? And so we had 11 speakers, each of about 10 minutes, sharing their best tips with the rest of the group. The month before that, we actually went and we didn't do anything educationally, but we did a speed dating so we could actually spend 7 minutes with each of the other members learning what they do, because the best referral is when I've finished talking for a client and they say, so who else do you know? And we call it the 5-finger principle. Who do you know who? And so that's a very common question. And if I'm saying, yes, this person down the road will give you a fantastic talk on X, Y, Z, it's good for us because it's within our own tribe, but it's also good for the client because they think I'm adding value to the particular client. So the last month we did learning about each other, and this month we did learning from each other. So it is hard to find content because Professional Speakers Australia and NSA in America, National Speakers Association in America, and professional speakers in the UK, etc. It's hard to define something about what it's not, and we often fall into that rabbit hole, that trap. There is a place for those who want to go from, oh my God, my knees knock before I get on stage, to standing up and actually charging a few $1,000s for a keynote speech. So there's a huge divide there. So we're talking about those who are being paid to speak, either as corporate trainers or as keynote speakers. Each one has their own style, unlike a Toastmaster. So we started off this discussion at the beginning on the traditional, the beginning, the middle, and the end, which is how you teach people to speak up front. When we're trying to improve skills of professional speakers now, we have to be so granular in those skills, and that nobody will come to a session and walk away saying, wow, I learned 2 hours worth of stuff, because they never will. But if everyone comes in and learns a little bit from each time they come in and uses that to apply themselves, that's all we can do. So for instance, coming up in this year, we have a session on sales. So one of the best sales coaches who does corporate sales training is coming in and talking to speakers about, are they marketing for 2021 and beyond? Has their marketing still sitting in 1999, or has it come along? How are they marketing? Don't be afraid of making the phone call and getting rejected. That kind of stuff. So he talks about, old style marketing, new style marketing, relationship marketing. That's one of the things coming up. One of the things coming up is on visual facilitation. Now, what is visual facilitation? So we, particularly in the era of Zoom, have got caught up in PowerPoint and death by PowerPoint, and too many words on a PowerPoint slide, and people who write out their entire speech and then just take chunks of it and put it onto PowerPoint slides in 10-point font, and no one can read it in the first place, and no graphics, and just pretty boring. And all they do is they sit behind a Zoom, share the screen, and just read it out, which is just boring as hell. You get people on stage who do the same thing. They put up this slide on the big screen. No one can read it, and they're still trying to read it. They're still trying to read it out, because if they miss one word, they're completely thrown.
I was at one of those right before the pandemic hit.
Yeah. And I see people in the corporate world and I see their presentations. Economists are the worst, all right? And that's just because I was in finance. I can take the piss out of economists. Economists are the worst because they will put up graphs that are so complicated. I look at people in the audience and their eyes have glazed over and they're trying to explain that dip in this curve did this and whatever. And there's 6 graphs superimposed on each other. That just doesn't work. So for instance, what is visual facilitation? It's going old school. It is going back to basics of using pen and paper. It's going back to basics of using flip charts, paper flip charts, or very big whiteboards, and actually not just drawing at random, but actually drawing with structure. And I've facilitated with someone who's done this training, and she's talking. And in the middle of talking, she is putting a little border around things or taking out another colored pen and putting a little sun in the corner. And it's become so part of her banter that you don't notice she's doing it. But then you look at what she's drawn and you go, wow, like that's amazing. There's a speaker in Australia, a guy named Colin James. Colin does caricatures, but the way he defines them, he'll be talking and drawing pictures on a screen that are on a piece of flip chart, and he'll turn around to the audience and then he'll reach back and draw, but only right at the end of his talk, which could be an hour. And he fills in the last line. Does the picture actually make sense? So he's got this brain where he can leave out particular elements and fill them in right at the end.
Yeah, that's a talent.
So that's the kind of stuff we're doing. So there are going to be some people who are going to go, well, I only do workshops and I'm not going to use flip charts, so I'm not going to come to it. That's okay. But I think we learn from every interaction like that. And so that's the challenge of how do you make people better? Because we're not out there critiquing their keynotes. That's not what professional speakers or NSA in America does, right? It's about self-development. It's about learning from your peers. And it's about the tribe. It is a lot about the tribe. It's about the people that we work with, we know, like, and trust. And yes, some of them I've sat down with and said, look, this is my new idea for a keynote. What do you think? And we've workshopped it. But that's not within the context of the organization.
Who knows better what you're going through than people who are on similar paths?
Oh, absolutely.
Well, Rael, it's been a pleasure to have you with us. Where can our listeners learn more about you?
So very simply, raelbricker.com, rael at raelbricker.com. That's RAELBRICKER, rael at raelbricker.com. They can contact me. In fact, if they're interested in the story, in the backstory, raelbricker.com/free book, they can actually download a free copy of my book called Dive In, Lessons Learned Since Business School. It encompasses, at that stage, 28 years since business school and what I've learned and how I applied what I learned at business school to life.
That's in the show notes. They can click on either one there, and I hope they do download your book. And thanks again for being here. Really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. I love talking about talking.
That's a wrap of another episode of Public Speaking with Peter George. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Tune in Monday when you'll hear another episode of Public Speaking with Peter George, and again Thursday for your next episode of Quick Bites, public speaking tips and techniques you can digest in 5 minutes or less. Until next time, remember, when it comes to speaking in public, you've got this.